Hey friends, what up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Zayin, Daf 77 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, Daf Ayin Zayin, Shtickle talks about Ammonis, Moavis, Mitzris, Edomis, and that kind of stuff. Ready to jump in? So, alright, we're going to start, we actually we did a little bit yesterday already, which is good. So we're about 15, 20 lines into the page already. Ketanoi, that it's like a machlekes tanoim. Amoni v'lo amonis, moavi v'lo moavis. Divrei Yehuda Reb Shimon Omer, advar shelo kidmu eschem balechem v'moim dako shlish tekadim v'chulei. We had seen yesterday two sources for how we know that, when it says that an Ammonite or Moabite is forbidden from marrying into the congregation. So how do we know that that only applies to the men and not to the women? The women can just kind of get right in. So we had quoted yesterday two sources, right? One from the fact that it says Ammoni to the exclusion of an Ammonis, and Moabi to the exclusion of a Moabis, right? Meaning Ammoni and Moabi is male, not female. And then we had a different verse that explained that, the men didn't come forward with bread and water. So, therefore, the men got punished. So, we had brought those two sources yesterday. And now we're saying it's actually a machlokas tanoim. That one opinion is this source, one opinion is that source. Let's read it again. Ketanois, we learned in machlokas tanoim, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis, divrei Yehuda. The Rebbe Yehuda's opinion is that, how do we know that the Ammoni ban, the prohibition, applies only to men, not to women? It's because it says Ammoni, not Ammonis, Moavi, and not Moavis. That's Rebbe Yehuda's opinion. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, Advar shelo kidmu eschem balechem v'moim dako shlish tekadim v'chulei, that the pasuk says that they're in trouble for not coming forward with bread and with water, and that is generally the way of the men, not the way of the women. Therefore, the prohibition applies to men. Darish Rave expounded my dichsiv pitachta l'moserai. What does the pasuk in Tilim mean when David HaMelech says pitachta l'moserai, that you opened up my yoke straps? David says, David l'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, before the Eibishter Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the world, Shnei Moseru shayu olai potachtem, that the two yoke straps that were upon me, you have opened, Rus HaMoaviyah v'Naima HaAmmonis, Rus the Moabite and Naima the Ammonite, that Kilu Ammonis and Moavis are not allowed to marry into the congregation, but we said that the women are, and therefore, right, and David comes from Rus, Shlomo married Naama Ammonis, so, and therefore his grandson Rehoboam is from Naima Ammonis. So David HaMelech reflects on the fact that the Eibishter, opened up his constraints, his yoke straps, by permitting the Ammoni and Moavi women. Darish Ravi expounded my dichsiv. What does it mean that it's written, Rabos asiso ata Hashem Elokai, that you've done a lot, God, niflosecho machshosecho eleinu, all your wonders and your thoughts upon us. Elai lo nemar ele eleinu. It doesn't say upon me, it says upon us. Lam chai Rehoboam Yoshe b'chekel shel David, that Rehoboam was sitting on David's lap. Omar lo, and David HaMelech says to Rehoboam, Olai ve'alecha, that upon me and upon you, nemu shtei mikros halalu, these two psukim that allow the Moabite women, the Ammonite and Moabite women, to marry into the congregation. They were said for us, that Kilu David HaMelech comes from Rus, Rehoboam, his grandson, comes from Naima, who was married to Shlomo. So you see that those verses that permit the Ammoni and Moavi women came in handy for David and his family. Darish Rav expanded my dichsiv. What does the pasuk mean? Also Marti, then I said, Hine Basi, now I have come to Megillah Sefer Kosov Olai, it is written upon me in a scroll. Omer David Ani Almighty Ato Basi. David HaMelech thought that he wasn't destined for greatness for a long time. He thought that it was kind of a last minute thing, things, sort of happened so that he could become king, but he didn't think that it was predetermined from time immemorial. Velo yodaiti sheb'megillah sefer kosov olai, And says David HaMelech, he didn't realize that it was already predetermined a way back that he was destined for greatness. Hosum Ksiv Hanimtzos, it says by Lot, right, that kind of take out the people that are found in the house. And it says here, Matzosi David Abdi B'Shem Kodshi Mishachtiv, that I found, right, like Hanimtzos by Lot, it says by David Matzosi, David Abdi, David, my servant, B'Shem Kodshi Mishachtiv, I anointed him with my holy oil. Amar Ula, says Ula, Amar B'Yochanan, Bas Ger Amoni Ksher Lechehuna. Says Ula, in the name of Yochanan, that the daughter of a Ger Ammoni, an Ammonite convert, a Ger Ammoni, Ksher Lechuna, she's allowed to marry a priest. Now, the assumption right now is that we're talking about a Ger Ammoni who married a Giores Ammoniya, right? Kielu, two Ammoni people married each other, which is allowed, right? Meaning an Ammoni is not allowed to marry into the congregation, but he can marry an Ammonis. So we're assuming for now that an Ammoni married an Ammonis, and they had a daughter, and that daughter can marry a Kohen. So Omerle Rav Bar Ula Leula. So now Rav Bar Ula says to Ula Kiman, who is that like? Whose opinion is that? Ik Rabbi Yehuda. Now, if we're going to argue that it's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Rabbi Yehuda says Bas Ger Zocher Kivas Cholo Zocher, that the daughter of a Ger, of a convert, is like the daughter of a Cholo. And therefore this Ger Ammoni, his daughter is going to be like the daughter of a Cholo, and the daughter of a Cholo is not allowed to marry a Kohen. V'ik Rabbi Yossi, and if it's like Rabbi Yossi Pshita, obviously Rabbi Yossi would say that the daughter of a Ger Ammoni and a Giores Ammonis would be able to marry a Kohen. Ha'amar, because after all Rabbi Yossi says, Af Ger Shenosa Giores, Bito Ksher Lechuna, that a convert, a Ger who marries a Giores, their daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen. Right, so we said a Ger or a Giores is not allowed to marry a Kohen, but the daughter, says Rabbi Yossi, is allowed to marry a Kohen. And therefore, the assumption is, well, if Rabbi Yossi says that a Ger and a Giores, their daughter can marry a Kohen, so then an Ammonia, a Ger Ammoni and a Ger Moavis, their daughter can also marry a Kohen. That's obvious. And if you can say, well, maybe it isn't so obvious because after all, a Ger and a Giores, they could marry into the congregation, into the call, which is not the case by a Ger Ammoni and a Giores Ammonis? I'll just say Giores Ammonis, why not? It sounds very Greek. Giores Ammonis. Greek or Roman? Maybe Roman. Giores Ammonis. Giores Ammonis. Giores Ammonis. Alright. So if you're going to say, yeah, but when Rabbi Yossi says that a Ger and a Giores, their daughter can marry a Kohen, that's because a Ger and a Giores can marry into the call, but a Ger Ammoni and a Giores Ammonis, they are not allowed to marry into the congregation, or at least the Ger is not allowed to marry into the congregation. The Ger Ammoni is not allowed to marry into the congregation. Right, so maybe Rabbi Yossi would not say that over here by a Ger Ammoni who's not allowed to marry into the congregation. So therefore, I might think that I might try to argue that Rabbi Yossi would say that in this case the daughter would be unable to marry a Kohen. But Minale, what's the difference? Why should there be any difference? Diyalif mi Kohen Gadol ba'amana. Maybe you'll say to learn it out from a Kohen Gadol who marries an Amana that their daughter is a Chalala and is not allowed to marry a daughter, a Kohen. But a Kohen Gadol ba'amana she can be also ba'aveira. But a Kohen Gadol marrying an Almana, that's a relationship that's not allowed to happen. So therefore, it's not so crazy to think that the daughter is a Chalala and cannot marry a Kohen. But in this case, a Ger Ammoni married a Giores Ammonis. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, their daughter should be able to marry a Kohen. Chalal Yuchiach. Okay, fine. Maybe we'll learn out from a Chalal that a Chalal is allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael, and nonetheless, their daughter would be unable to marry a Kohen. So here also, this Ger Ammoni is allowed to marry this Giores Ammonis, but nonetheless, their daughter would be unable to marry a Kohen. But Chalal, you can't learn out from Chalal because a Chalal was born from a forbidden relationship, right? You don't just become a Chalal. There's a reason why you're a Chalal. As I like to point out, I have a friend growing up who thought he was a Chalal. So you don't just become a cholol. There's a reason why you're a cholol. I.e., right? You were born in a relationship that wasn't allowed, right? Kohen gadol la'amona, grusha v'achalutz to the kohen hedjit. But here, ger amoni married a gioris amonis. What's the problem? So kohen gadol yochiach, okay. But then maybe let's go back to the kohen gadol, where the kohen gadol wasn't born, right? He was born to children that were fine, and yet his right. Meaning the kohen gadol, he doesn't come from a relationship that wasn't allowed, right? We said the cholol came from a relationship that wasn't allowed. That's why he became a cholol, and therefore his daughter is not going to be able to marry a kohen. But the kohen gadol came from a relationship that was allowed. There was nothing wrong with his parents' relationship, and yet his daughter is unable to marry a kohen. So maybe then we'll say that also this relationship, the geramoni and the gioris amonis, yeah, sure, their relationship is okay, but maybe nonetheless their daughter would be unable to marry a kohen. I'm sorry. I messed it up. That the kohen gadol was right. So he comes from an acceptable relationship, and this amoni also, right? Meaning, even though the kohen gadol comes from an acceptable relationship, still his daughter is not allowed to marry a kohen. So here also the amoni comes from right. His parents are just fine, and yet we'll say that his children are unable to marry. His daughter is unable to marry a kohen, but but then we ask the same question. But the kohen gadol, that comes right. The kohen gadol b'amona is a forbidden relationship. The ger amoni and the gioris amonis is not a forbidden relationship. To which the Gemara says, look, if you try to bring it from the kohen gadol, sure, you'll have problems. That's a forbidden relationship. If you try to bring it from the cholol, you're going to have issues because the cholol comes from a relationship that wasn't allowed. But but what's the common thread? She'eno birov kol uvito psula. Look, they did something that is not allowed, right? The kohen gadol is not allowed to marry the widow. The cholol, his parents, his parents had engaged in a relationship that wasn't allowed. Safkan she'eno birov kol uvito psula. So here also I'll say, look, the Ammoni and the Moavis. So also it's not like a completely normal situation, because after all the Ammoni is unable to marry into the congregation. So Malat Tzadashava Sheboin Sheken Yesh Boin Tzadaver. To which the Gemara says, but still, you can't just compare the Kohen Gadol and the Cholol and the Ger Ammoni, because the Kohen Gadol and the Cholol are mamish. There's an avera there. Right? The Kohen Gadol marrying the widow, it's an avera. The cholol is parents engaged in an avera. The Ammoni and the Moavi, the Geramoni and the Gioris Amonis are really not doing anything wrong at all. So Rava Bar Ula then suggested his father Dilma Ba'amoni Shenosa Bas Yisrael Kamad. Okay, maybe we're not talking about a Ger Ammoni that married a Gioris Amonis. Rather, maybe we're talking about an Ammoni who married a Bas Yisrael. Oh, so an Ammoni is not allowed to marry into the call, but let's say he did. Can that daughter, if they have a daughter, can that daughter then marry a Kohen? So, Afagav de Bioso Ba'avera Bito Kishere. And we're saying that even though the Geramoni married a Bas Yisrael and he wasn't allowed to, but maybe I'll say, maybe what we're saying over here, what Rabbi Yochanan was saying, is that this daughter is nonetheless allowed to marry a Kohen. Amalei. And Ula says, yes, that's exactly right. That a Geramoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, so that daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen. Dechi also Ravin, Rabbi Yochanan, Bas Geramoni uvas mitzvi sheni, that if you have the daughter of an Ammoni or the daughter of a mitzvi sheni, right, and they were married to a Bas Yisrael, right? So if you have a Ger Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, or a Bas Mitzri Sheni, a second generation Mitzri, who is not allowed to marry into the congregation, but in either of these cases, the Ger Ammoni or the Mitzri Sheni, if they marry into the congregation, if they marry a Bas Yisrael, so Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kshera, Rish Lakish Amar Psula. Rabbi Yochanan says that she's Kshera, that she's allowed to marry a kohen, and Rish Lakish says that she's not allowed to marry a kohen. Rish Lakish Amar Psula the Yalef La Mikohen Gadol B'Amana. So Rish Lakish says that she would be unable to marry a kohen because he learns it out like an amana to kohen gadol. It's a relationship that's not allowed. And by the amana and the kohen gadol, the child's a chalala. So you also say that a ger amoni who marries a bas Yisrael, that's not allowed. So the child's going to be unable to marry a kohen. Rabbi Yochanan says that she's allowed to marry a kohen. The Tani Reb Zakkai came to Rabbi Yochanan. The Reb Zakkai taught before Rabbi Yochanan ki im besula me'ama v'kachisha. It says by the kohen gadol that he has to davke marry a besula, and says Reb Zakkai in front of Reb Yochanan, lehavi gioris mikana, that this also comes to include a giores mikana sheikshir the kahuna, that she's allowed to marry a kahuna. What's a giores mikana? A convert from the same heritage, i.e., for example, if you have a geramoni and a giores amonis, so then they would be able to marry into the kihuna v'amalei. And Reb Yochanan says to Reb Zakkai, Ani shone amav me amav lavi besula haba mi beis amomin. Says Reb Yochanan that I learn out from the fact that it could have said it's ki besulas amav yikach isha, and it didn't need to say me amav. From the extra mem of mei amav, so he learns out lavi besula haba mi beis amomin, to include a besula that comes from two nations. So we're going to have to explain what this means in a second. And you, Reb Zakkai, are only saying that a geramoni who's married to a ger moavis, to a geras amonis, their daughter would be allowed to marry a kohen. Let's go weiter for a second. So what does this mean, the two nations? If you say an Ammoni that married an Ammonis, then what does it mean that from two nations, i.e. that we treat the Ammonis like two nations, i.e. that the males are not allowed to marry into the congregation, and the females are? That would be the same thing as this Gioris of the same heritage. Let's just wrap this up. Rather, it's talking about an Ammoni who married a Bas Yisrael, and we're saying that the daughter can marry a Geramoni who married a Bas Yisrael, and we're saying that the daughter can marry a Kohen. Friends, what does that mean? Meaning, Reb Zakkai had come, and maybe let's read the Brisa again in a second, but Reb Zakkai had come and he had brought this Brisa, right, that he says that by Kohen Gadol says Kim besula meyama v'yikachisha, and Reb Zakkai wanted to say that this comes to include that, to say that if you have a ger Ammoni who marries a gioris Ammonis, so their daughter is allowed to marry a kohen, and that's what's called the gioris mikana, a convert, right, a daughter born to converts that come from the same heritage, right? A ger Ammoni, a gioris Ammonis, fine. Now, Rabbi Yochanan had said, hey, Reb Zakkai, you're not including enough. Rabbi Yochanan says, I learn out from, right, it could have just said Amav, but it says Mei Amav, to say that even if they come from two different nations. And what does that mean, that they come from two different nations? Well, it means, even in a situation where, you have a ger Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, still that daughter would be able to marry a Kohen. Right, that even, right, so Reb Zakkai had said if you have a Geramoni in a Gioris Ammonis, their daughter can marry a Kohen. But it says Rabbi Yochanan, even if it's a Geramoni marries a Bas Yisrael, even that daughter would be able to marry a Kohen. Let's read it again, from the top of the page. Tani Reb Zakkai, comment Reb Yochanan, Reb Zakkai taught before Reb Yochanan came, Besul me'amav yikach isha, that a Kohen Gadol dafka needs to marry a Besul lavi Gioris mikana, and what we learn out from there is that a daughter born to a ger Ammoni and a gioris Ammonis, i.e. they come from the same heritage, sheikshir lechuna, she's allowed to marry kuna v'amalei, and says Rabbi Yochanan to Reb Zakkai, ani shone amav me amav lavi b'sul haba mi beis amomin. Says Rabbi Yochanan that I learn out from the extra mem from me amav to teach that even a besula, right, a virgin girl whose parents come from two nations, and we're going to have to explain what two nations means in a second, but of course it means that the father is a Ger Amoni and the mother is a Bas Yisrael. And you, Reb Zakkai, are saying only a daughter born from a Ger Amoni and a Gioris Amonis, but not from a Ger Amoni and a Bas Yisrael. Now we say, when Rabbi Yochanan says that I even include a daughter born from parents from parents from two different nations, so what does that mean? Ilema Amoni Shanosa Amonis. If you're going to say that it means an Ammoni who marries an Ammonis, and then what does it mean that they come from two different nations? It means that, well, you have the male Ammonis and the female Ammonis. The male Ammonis are allowed to marry to the congregation, the female Ammonis aren't. But Hanu Gioris Mikana, but that's the same thing as the Gioris Mikana that Reb Zakkai was talking about, right? That they're both, right? The Ammoni marries an Ammonis. So rather, Rabbi Yochanan must be talking about an Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, and he's saying that nonetheless the daughter is permitted to marry a Kohen. Vika Adamri, there are those who say, Omerle, there are those who say that Rabbi Yochanan was actually explicit about the fact that he's talking about a Ger Ammoni who married a Bas Yisrael, right? We just now, in this version of the Brisa, we had to figure it out, right? The Rabbi Yochanan says that I'm even including a Basula Abami Beis Amam that comes from two nations, and we explained what does it mean two nations. We had to figure out that it meant a Ger Ammoni and a Bas Yisrael. But there are those who have a version where actually Rabbi Yochanan is explicit that he's talking about a Ger Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael. So let's read it now. Those who say Omerle that Rabbi Yochanan says to Reb Zakkai, Anishona Amav Me Amav Lavi Basula Abba Mishne Amamin, that I learn out from the extra mem that even a Basula who's born to parents from two nations, Ume Am Shiesh Bo Shne Amamin, and from a nation that has two nations. Let's go weiter. Vatomet Gioris Mikana Basulo, and you only talk about a Ger Ammoni and a Gioris Ammonis. Ulach Lishna. Okay, so Kilu. So the way to understand this, let's read that again. Right, Kilu, if they come from two Amamin, i.e., Kilu, even if it's an Ammoni and an Ammonis, or even Me'am Sheish B'Shnei Amamin, even if it's an Ammoni and a Bas Yisrael, but the Ammoni is considered two nations, since Kilu, the males are permitted to are forbidden from marrying, and the females are permitted. So it's like Kilu, they're two nations, right? We treat it's like divided into two, the males and the females, right? So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying that a Ger Ammoni married to a Gioris Ammonis, or even a Ger Ammoni married to a Bas Yisrael, the daughter would be allowed to marry a Kohen. And you, Reb Zakkai, are only saying that a Ger Ammoni married to a Gioris Ammonis, the daughter can marry a Kohen and that's it. You don't talk about the Ger Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael. So now, according to this, how does Rabbi Yochanan know that an Egyptian convert, a second generation Egyptian convert, who is married to a Bas Yisrael, that their daughter can marry a Kohen? And if you're going to say from an Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, but maybe that's not, you can't learn it from there, right? Meaning, if we want to say, right, if you have a second generation Egyptian who marries a Bas Yisrael, so how do we know that the daughter from that relationship can marry a Kohen? So if we say, well, if you have an Ammoni who marries a Bas Yisrael, their daughter can marry a Kohen, but maybe Ammoni is a little bit more lenient, since, after all, by Ammonis, the women are at least allowed to marry immediately, which is not the case by Egyptians, right? You have to, right, the restriction of 3 generations applies to men and women. So mitzvah sheni also mitzvahs shniya yochiach, right? So why don't we learn out from a second generation mitzvah male who marries a second generation mitzvah female that their daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen? So mala mitzvah sheni shenosa mitzvah shniya But the thing is, a second generation Mitzri who marries a second generation Mitzris, there's nothing wrong with that at all. So there's no, certainly their daughter who's now a third generation and permitted to the congregation can marry a Kohen. So an Ammoni shenosa bas Yisrael yochiach. Okay, but then let's go back then to the relationship between an Ammoni who's married to bas Yisrael, that's not allowed, and yet we're saying that the daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen. So but then you're going to say, yeah, but maybe Ammoni is more lenient because the women are allowed to marry to the congregation. So then we'll say, look, an Ammoni to bas Yisrael, it's got its problems. A second generation Mitzri to second generation Mitzri has its problems. But the fact of the matter is that we're talking about relationships that aren't allowed, and yet the daughter is going to be allowed to marry a Kohen. So therefore, a second generation Mitzri who marries a bas Yisrael, their daughter would be able to marry a Kohen as well. Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, this is what we heard from Rav Yehuda, the Amar, Amav me Amav, right? It says Rav Yosef that they heard from Rav Yehuda, from their teacher Rav Yehuda, that he was talking about this limud from Amav, me Amav, the extra mem. We didn't know what he was talking about. He was talking about this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan about including a Geramoni married to bas Yisrael, that the child can marry a Kohen. Now we get to another version of exactly the incident that was between Reb Zakkai and Reb Yochanan, and the reading is like a little bit funny, but let's see. This is what Reb Zakkai taught before Reb Yochanan. Isha Amonis Kshera. Okay, so an Ammonite woman is allowed to marry into the congregation. Fine. Bename Ammoni Pasul. If they have a son, so he's not allowed to marry into the congregation because the Ammonis are not allowed to marry into the congregation, just the daughters, the women. Uvita me Ammoni Kshera, and his daughter from an Ammoni is Kshera. Her daughter from an Ammoni is Kshera. When are we saying this? Ba'Ammoni va'Ammonis shenizgairu, by an Ammoni and Ammonis that converted. Aval bita me Ammoni psula, but his daughter from an Ammoni is psula. We have to keep reading. Amale poktini livra, to which Rabbi Yochanan says to Reb Zakkai, you better get out of here and teach this outside. Now, my de omart isha Ammonis kshera. So look, that which you said, right? Rabbi Yochanan says to Reb Zakkai, that which you said that an isha Ammonis is kshera, that if a woman Ammoni is able to marry into the congregation, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, of course. That's a Ammoni is not allowed to marry into the congregation, but the Ammonises are. Bename Ammoni Pasul, her daughter from an Ammoni, her son from an Ammoni is not allowed to marry to the congregation, to Ammoniu, because he's a male Ammoni. Uvita me Ammoni Kshera, and when we say that her daughter from an Ammoni is Kshera, lemai. With regard to what? Ilema, who is this? Ilema Lova Bakal, if we're saying that the daughter is allowed to marry into the congregation, Ashta Imo Kshera, Himi Boya, if the mother, right, is already, right, which is a Ammonite convert, is allowed to marry to the congregation because she's female. So then obviously her daughter would be allowed to marry into the congregation. So L'chuna, rather we're talking about to marry a Kohen. When are we talking, what is it said? Ba'Ammoni va'Ammonis shenizgairu, that in Ammoni and Ammonis who converted, Aval bita me Ammoni psula, but her daughter from an Ammoni is psula. We have to go weiter. My bita me Ammoni. What does it mean that her daughter from an Ammoni? Ilema Ammoni shenosa Ammonis. Well, if we're going to say that the daughter from an Ammoni who is married to Ammonis, well, Hanugiris Mikana, that is a convert with proper heritage, and of course that's going to be permitted. Ela Ammoni shenosa bas Yisrael. Rather, it must be an Ammoni that is married to a bas Yisrael. And we're saying, and Reb Zakkai is concluding that an Ammoni shenosa bas Yisrael is not allowed, Amale poktini livra, to which Rabbi Yochanan says, you better go and teach outside, because a Ammoni who marries a bas Yisrael is permitted to marry a Kohen. Now we move on to the next part of the Mishnah that says, Mitzvi v'Adomi and an Asur and v'chulei. So the Mishnah had said that an Egyptian and an Edomite, so their converts are not allowed to marry to the congregation for 3 generations, but after that they can, and that applies to men and women. Reb Shimon says that it only applies to the men and not to the women. And he says the Kal V'chomer, right? He says, well, if by an Ammoni, which the men are not allowed to marry into the congregation ever for all generations, and yet the women are allowed to marry into the congregation. So, and certainly a Ammoni, certainly an Egyptian and an Edomite, where it only applies for 3 generations, certainly then the women should be able to marry in immediately. To which the rabbis said that, they question him, they say, are you saying that because you heard this as a halacha? Or are you just saying that from your own logic? Because if you're saying it from your own logic, then we have a retort for you. We have a way to respond. So my tshuva, says the Gemara, okay, we want to know what this response is that you could respond to Reb Shimon, to prove him wrong, to say that by Egyptians and Edomites it applies to the men and the women for those 3 generations. So my tshuva, well, because Reb Shimon, we could just say, yeah, but what about arayas? That by arayas, right, it's don't sleep with your daughter, your granddaughter, so it's 3 generations, and it applies to the men and to the women. So therefore, I will also include an Edomite and a Egyptian, that it's for 3 generations, and it applies to men and to women. Karis, yeah, but come on, arais, you can't learn from arais, it's super stringent, there's a chiyuv karis. So mamzer yochech, fine, so then let's learn enough from mamzer, that there's no chiyuv karis by mamzer. If you see with the mamzer, there's no chiyuv karis, and mamzer applies to men and to women. Mala mamzer, shkein eno roi lover bakal le'olam, yeah, but a mamzer is unable to marry into the congregation forever, whereas an Egyptian or Edomite just needs to wait 3 generations. So, arayos uchichu, okay, fine. So let's learn it out for arayos, which are only 3 generations. V'chazor adin, but then you're going to ask the same kasha, yeah, but that's karis. So, lo rizeh, k'rizeh, lo rizeh, k'rizeh, look. We got problems with mamzers, with the mamzer, bringing a proof from a mamzer. We have a problem with bringing a proof from arayos. But it's at a shavush shaboyin, but there's a common ground, shasurin, that they are not allowed, v'echad zchorim v'echad nikevos, and it applies to both boys and girls. Afani ovi mitzri u'mitzris, so I'll say the same thing by mitzri and a mitzris, sheyiyu asurin echad zchorim v'echad nikevos, and say that it applies to both men and to women. So therefore, Reb Shimon, how could you say that it's logical? How could you argue that it's logical to say that the Egyptians and Edomites only apply to the men but not to the women? If I could bring, essentially put together a proof based on a combination of arayos and mamzer to teach that it will apply both to men and to women. So malatzad hashavish ben shekeni yesh bo inside karis, to which Reb Shimon would retort and say, yeah, but when it comes to mamzer and when it comes to arayos, they both have sort of an aspect of karis. Right? Arayos, of course, has an aspect of karis, right? That if you do these relationships, you chayiv karis. But even a mamzer, how do you become a mamzer? Become a mamzer because your parents engaged in a relationship that there's a chiyuv karis involved in that relationship. Right? For example, you sleep with your sister, there's a baby, so then the child is a mamzer. So therefore, both mamzer and arayos have like a karis thing going on, which is not necessarily the case by Edomites and Egyptians. But now the rabbis, sort of their response for their position to say that the Egyptians and Edomites applies both to men and to women is because they learn it out from chayve esay, right? Meaning, how do we know that you're not allowed to marry Edomites and Egyptians for the first 3 generations? Because it says, and the pasuk only says in the 3rd generation that they're then allowed to marry in the congregation, implying that the first 2 generations you're not allowed to. So it's a chiyuv asay, right? From an implication of a positive commandment. And also we know that if a kohen gadol with a anusa mufuta, a woman who was raped or seduced, so the only reason why a kohen gadol would not be allowed to marry her is because it says Kim b'sula me'am v'yikach isha, right? That he has to marry a basula, implying, well, then he memele cannot marry an anusa umufuta. So therefore, by Kohen Gadol, we see that if he marries a anusa umufuta, which is a chiyuv essay, and it's like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov who says that child will be a cholo, and that applies both to whether the child is a boy or a girl. So therefore the rabbis want to say that also by Egyptians and Edomites, which is a chiyuv asay, so that would apply to both men and to women. Umayloki. And what does it mean that Reb Shimon responds and says, no, not true? This is what he's saying to him. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, look, he says, I don't hold of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. I don't hold that chiyuv essay would be, the child would be a chalal, and that it would apply to both boys and girls. And according to you people, that you do hold like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that by the chiyuv essay the child will be a chalal. So then look, at the end of the day, halacha ani omer, I'm not just making up this svara on my own. I actually have this tradition. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Reb Shimon said to them, halacha ani omer, I'm saying that it's a halacha. Also we have a pasuk which says banim and lo banos. We'll start off with this brisa tomorrow, but to say that it only applies to the men and not to the women. Friends, that was the Ein Zayin of Masechta Yevamos. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.